This has to be probably one of the most difficult panels I've ever had to discuss, because of the huge variety, and it's difficult to discuss on issues of personal memory and history. I would recommend, one of the panelists, Professor Mogotchi, wrote a very long paper for the panel, and I would recommend, if it is going to be available on the website of CIUS, that you download and read it, because he obviously couldn't talk about the entire paper in his 10 or 15 minutes. And I would highly recommend that the others write up their talks and maybe get the whole thing published, because I think it is highly fascinating, even for people like me. I didn't know a lot of what I heard today. There are some common themes that, for example, about the American influx into Canada, and we have 3 of the 4 speakers are Americans today. The fact that Professor Mogotchi brings out the point that, which I don't think other speakers did, that to be a Ukrainianist at that time in the 70s, 80s, you had to be somebody with Ukrainian background. It couldn't be the case that somebody without Ukrainian background could actually work in Ukrainian studies, which I thought was a very interesting point. And it's an interesting point because it makes it very different to political science, because the majority of people working on Ukraine in political science don't have a Ukrainian background. And that makes the two fields very different. The exceptions, Motul, Kuzio, but the majority aren't. I also thought it was interesting, and I think it's a very valid point that Professor Sisson brought out about the other institutions we shouldn't forget. I mean, I worked for Prolog from the kind of early 80s until 1991, when US government money ran out. And I think, and I have written one academic article about Prolog. The archives are open, US government archives are open about Prolog until the 1970s. This was an incredible institution that, because it wasn't tied to diaspora money, particularly nationalist money, it could do all the things that the nationalist community couldn't. For example, write, publish books on national communism, publish books on Jewish-Ukrainian relations, on Polish-Ukrainian relations. And there's a great relationship with the very, very influential and also US government-funded Kultura publishing house in Paris. So I think that's very important to bring out. It's still an area that's worth researching for any young scholars around, because the range of publications and books and such like that was produced by Prolog is really astounding. I just interviewed in Kiev Anatoly Kaminsky. He's over 90 now. He's working in the former KG archives in Kiev under the SBU. And he was one of the founding members of Prolog, and then went on to head Ukrainian Service of Radio Liberty. Again, fascinating individual. I thought there's also a common theme here at both the University of Toronto and the University of Alberta. We're talking back then that there was nobody interested in Ukraine. There was, in fact, probably hostility to the idea of creating Ukrainian studies both here and in Toronto. In Professor Mogotchi's paper, there are some interesting nuances which I'll let you read yourselves rather than bringing up here, because they they include references to 2 other people on the panel, which I thought probably diplomatically maybe shouldn't really talk about. But of course the whole, when I read Mogotchi's paper, I thought this, and especially about the period of time, late 70s, early 80s, I thought of Andy Warhol and the whole Andy Warhol experience here. For where, of course, Professor Mogotchi stands out in relation and makes him different to the other Ukrainian studies institutions, in that he was isolated from, and he talks about this in his paper, from the Ukrainian diaspora. The other organizations weren't. Why that was the case is a separate question. We can go into that in the discussion. But as he points out, he was practically taboo with the Ukrainian diaspora until about 2007. And he was taboo in Ukraine, in independent Ukraine, for about the first 2 decades, or just less than the first 2 decades. These things change in the case of Professor Mogotchi in a period of time really from 2007 to about 2010, 2011, 12, with the publication of his work. If we can think of the impact of the Ukrainian diaspora on Ukraine in the 1990s, then Oris Subtelny had that massive impact, particularly because he was there at the right time in the right place, with the publication of his History of Ukraine in '89 in Toronto, and then in 1991 the Ukrainian and Russian editions published in Kiev. And then this was massively and kind of illegally reproduced in hundreds of thousands of copies. I remember going to Donetsk in 1994 to the university, and Oris Subtelny's History of Ukraine was used at Donetsk University in 1994. But the next decade was Mogotchi's decade, with the publication of the first edition of his history in 2007, and then subsequently the second edition, and the Ukrainian translations, and then other similar books on Ukrainian history, and the more recent one on the history of the Ukrainian Tatars. I find it incredible that Professor Mogotchi could knew in advance when the Russians were going to take power and annex the Crimea, and timed the publication of the history of the Crimean Tatars in April 2014. Did you have advance notice? In 2009, I helped to organize a panel of scholars from Harvard and elsewhere, Dominic Carrel, Alexander Motyl, Harvard, at St. Vladimir's Institute in Toronto, which I thought was, as an outsider not from Canada, I saw that this isolation of Mogotchi from the community was rather ridiculous, particularly as we're now going on to nearly 20, 30 years. And this, I think, broke the ice. Daria Derevich came up to me after the panel and said, this should have been done long ago. And then Boris, he mentions in his paper in 2010, I introduced him, or we met together with Boris Wrzesniewski, then a Liberal MP, and again and now a Liberal MP. And Boris was one of the opponents of Mogotchi taking the chair in 1980, and of course this was now long water under the bridge. So as he puts it in his paper, his relationship with the Ukrainian diaspora has gone from alienation to cooperation and everything in between. But I think there's a fascinating bit in this paper about the whole question of his relationship to Ukraine, and how that did open up new opportunities, but at the same time there was a lot of suspicion about him for his interest in Transcarpathia and of course the Rusin movement. It was a very strange thing for me to see how somebody who was ostracized by the community for so long at the same time had massive very large student groups. And all of those students, people I go out for drinks with in Toronto, have extremely fond memories of his teaching. So there was always a strange dichotomy there. You're right to point out the changes at Harvard. Mogotchi now finally has a competitor in terms of publishing, Sergei Plokhy. There is competition on the block, and we'll see how that goes. But I think we'll leave it to discussion, the whole question he raised about whether there are too many institutions today. But talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, to me this is an interesting thing that we can bring up, and where I'd like to take my comments. Professor Mogotchi talks about how the collapse of the Soviet Union and coming about of an independent Ukraine, quote, changed the rules of the game, and finally Ukrainian studies became normalized. Ukrainian scholars in the West could no longer be smug and intellectually superior to scholars in Ukraine. I would agree with that only up to a point, because I think there's been, and Frank Sisson and others have talked about this, incredible interaction between Ukrainian studies in the West and Ukraine in the fields particularly of history. And if you go to a Ukrainian bookstore, say in Kiev, you'll see a huge selection of, I don't do history, but of books on Ukrainian history, particularly on the Holodomor, on the 1940s. But that's not the case in political science. I think what I'd like to sort of, maybe that's one of the reasons I was invited to be discussant, is to say that Ukrainian studies didn't change after 1991. It didn't become broader and more inclusive and bring in political science. And this is something I'd like to ask here Zenon Kohut, because he was the director for most of that period from 91, why that was the case. Why was political science not really brought in? One understands why it wasn't part of Ukrainian studies prior to 91, but why post-91 Ukrainian studies still doesn't really include political science. Of course, there's an exception with University of Ottawa, opened more recently. And I think we have seen tremendous progress in the field of history writing and historians in Ukraine, but what we have in terms of political science is practically a disaster zone. Sergei Kudelya wrote a few years ago, there isn't a political science in Ukraine. There's not a single political science journal in Ukraine. There were 2 or 3 in the 1990s, but today there are none. In fact, of the 5 weekly political magazines, 3 are in Russian, 2 are in Ukrainian. Political science scholars in Ukraine are pretty mediocre. Very few of them get published in the West, unlike historians. There's, I would say, a high level of provincialism, inward-looking, very little contact, and very little access to Western publications. So there is a project for us, if we want that project, to do with political science in Ukraine what we did with history in Ukraine in the 1990s. And although we have our own problems here, the CIUS journal, for example, if one looks at it, hasn't covered the Crimea, Donbass, or the Ukrainian war, or the Euromaidan since 2014. Why has the CIUS journal ignored that? I can't talk about the Harvard Journal because the last issue was 2014. This is important because one of the functions I remember from that era of the 70s and 80s and some of the speakers have alluded to this, was to create these institutions, was to combat Russophilia in the West. I remember a leaflet from Harvard Ukrainian Institute saying it's not Russia, it's the Soviet Union. It's not, you shouldn't mix the two entities up. Today, we have a massive onslaught of Russian propaganda, literally massive. And in the last 3 years, on the Ukrainian-Russia crisis, on the war, on Euromaidan, there have been the biggest publication ever since 1991. We have now close to 300 academic articles and think tank occasional papers published. That's never been the case on the subject of Ukraine. But the problem is most of those are written by Russianists and others, not really by Ukrainianists. And Ukrainian studies is not part of that debate. If you're not part of the debate, you can't really influence the debate. One of the areas which is particularly lacking is, of course, the issue of social media, which is one of the big areas of Putin's hybrid information war. And can I just say, historians don't really do social media. Political scientists do, but historians don't. And I'll explain what Facebook is later. Two of the people on the panel don't use email. So I sent my PowerPoint to well, I won't say his name, I'm finishing now, a Ukrainianist, a PowerPoint I gave yesterday to a Ukrainianist yesterday, and his computer crashed because it still uses dial-up. What can we say? On a final note, Professor Magocci's comment about, I just comment quickly about the International Center he talked about. I think certainly I would argue that if we want to help Ukraine, and if you have no political science, where do you get your political elites from? Where? I mean, one problem is, of course, very few Ukrainian elites know English. And even if they know English, like Poroshenko, Yatsenyuk, they don't read English publications. They don't use Google, they use Yandex, the Russian website search. So that provincialism at a time when you want to escape Russia's influence and you want to join Europe is very, very important. If you want to help Ukraine today, then help it in the field of political science like you helped it in the field of history in the 2 decades after 1991. But on the International Center, I think it's obviously, I think it's a great idea, but such a center will never probably take place in Canada. The reason for that is, for example, if you were to find a Ukrainian oligarch to fund that, or Ukrainian oligarchs to fund that, they're interested only in Washington, Brussels, and London, not in Canada. Canada's not a foreign policy player. Of the 5 different centers, we can debate separately, but certainly there's a need to work in a broader field of what we originally believed Ukrainian studies worked in, which is combating Russophilia and such like. And that is an area that I think Ukrainian studies can and should move into. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.